Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're in Nehemiah chapter 7. We're going to be starting verse 2 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, in chapter 7, verse 1, Nehemiah, the wall is built, and now he sets up porters to walk around the wall to keep an eye on who's going in and who is going out. He sets up singers also and the Levites. So Nehemiah is getting people organized and having people start doing duties in the city of Jerusalem. And now we come to verse 2. And we're going to finish this chapter, this lesson. It says here in verse 2, that I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the ruler of the palace, charge over Jerusalem. For he was a faithful man, and he feared God above many. Now, we know from chapter 1 and verse 2 of Nehemiah that Hanani was not really Nehemiah's blood brother, but he was a fellow brother Jewish person, brother of Israel, and that's basically what Nehemiah is saying. He's not saying my brother, blood brother Hanani, but he's a part of the same family, a tribe of Abraham. Hananiah was the one who was in charge of protecting the temple site and the city also. He would be in command of troops. Nehemiah calls Hananiah a faithful man and that he feared God above many. Now, based upon what we have read in the last part of chapter 6, Nehemiah needed people who were faithful to God. As we said, the wall has been built, but even though the wall is built, Nehemiah still has enemies inside the wall just as well as outside the wall. And Nehemiah needs faithful men who fear God and will be on his side. You know, throughout history, some of the greatest works of God in this world were done by people who were not the most educated or the most talented, but they were humble and they were faithful to God. Education in the Christian faith is important, but education will not instill faithfulness. Ministry leaders desire, above all things, faithful people who will see the work through. And this is God can use anybody. God doesn't need the most intelligent or the most wealthy people for the gospel to be spread around the world. God can use anybody. And he does. And he does, right? He's using us. We're anybody's. Well, he uses us. So here it says here, he says, I gave my brother Hanani and Hananiah, the ruler of the palace, I gave him charge over Jerusalem. Why? Why did he give him charge over Jerusalem? Why? Because he was a faithful man and he feared God above many. He wasn't the most educated. You know, he didn't go to Jerusalem Seminary and all that other kind of stuff. No, he was a faithful man unto God and to the work that God was doing. Verse number 3, and I said unto them, meaning Hanani and Hananiah, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun be hot, and while they stand by, let them shut the doors and bar them, and appoint watches of the inhabitants of Jerusalem, every one in his watch, and everyone to be over against his house. Now, the gates of the city. Remember, the wall has been freshly built, and now they're starting to get organized as to who's coming in and who's going out. How do we operate this city now? It's basically an empty city, pretty much. But how do we operate? How are we going to organize this city? And the gates were to be opened long after sunrise, so that the guards could see clearly and at a distance if there were enemies coming. And they probably were to be closed before the watch finished their time. So when they opened the gates, it was long after sunrise. And they were also to be closed before sundown, probably long before sundown. They wanted to make sure that the enemies weren't coming in or out. And it says here in verse 3, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun be hot, and while they stand by. Now, it is possible that Nehemiah wanted Hananiah and Hananiah to be present at the opening and the closing of the gates. And if they couldn't do it, then those who were appointed to look at those who were appointed to look after the gates should do it. Again, remember, there's 12 gates around the city of Jerusalem. Is it possible that Nehemiah wanted Hananiah and Hananiah to go to each single gate and watch it be open, 12 times every day, and then 12? I mean, it's possible. It's possible that there was that much concern and care for the city because it was just freshly built and just starting up again, that they wanted to make sure that they were protected. So it's possible they wanted that the Nehemiah wanted them to observe the opening of each gate. The gate had to be shut until they got there to see it. It's possible, but it's also possible that Hananiah couldn't be at every gate, so they would have people appointed that would watch the gate being opened and watch the gates being closed. Verse 4, now the city was large and great, but the people were few therein, and the houses were not builded. Now, it says the people were few therein. In the two returns, the return of Zerubbabel and the return of Ezra, about 50,000 Jews had returned to Jerusalem under those two returns by the time of Nehemiah. Now, so when Zerubbabel came back, there was, I think, about 47,000 people that came with him. That was just a drop in the bucket, according to how many Jews actually lived in Babylon. And now it's about 60 years, it's about 75 years later now. It's about 60 years later when Ezra comes back. When he goes to Jerusalem. Ezra now goes to Jerusalem, and Ezra takes with him a little bit over 2,000. So there's about 50,000 people, Jewish people, that leave Babylon and go to Jerusalem to worship God and to set up new lives, to begin their new life there in Israel, and to be able to worship God freely there. So, but the majority of the people that it's about during Nehemiah's time is about 15 years after Ezra went to Jerusalem. So it's about 75 years later after Zerubbabel's return that these Jewish people have been living in the promised land, in and around Jerusalem. And these people now they're spread out. They're not just in the city of Jerusalem. The Bible says here in verse 4, it says here, now the city was large and great, but the people were few therein. Nobody lived in, I shouldn't say nobody, very few people lived inside the city wall. Most of the people that came back, these 50,000 people that came back, they were spread out throughout the land of Judea. They went down to Beersheba. They went to other different cities and towns and villages, and they set their lives up there. They built houses in there. So there was hardly anybody living in the city now. And it says here, the houses were not built. Now, the workers on the wall probably had some kind of building to live in while if they worked as watching the wall, they probably had their houses inside the city, and they had some kind of a makeshift house that they lived in. Of the rubble that was in the city, they probably put boards and stones together to make a makeshift house to live in. Any houses or buildings in the city before the fall were now in ruins. Remember, when Nebuchadnezzar comes down to Jerusalem and he destroys the city and takes the Jews to Babylon in captivity, he destroys the city. I mean, he wrecks everything. He tears down the temple and strips the temple, the gold and silver from Solomon's temple, takes it all, whatever is left. And then he destroys the city, breaks down much of the wall and destroys the houses and any buildings inside the city. So when they go back and they start building this wall, there's nothing, it's just rubble. You just have to put stuff together, put rocks on top of rocks and make a roof. And that's what you live in, I guess. Eventually, they would have to build new houses inside the city wall. And there was a lot of empty space in the city. So here you have a huge city with a wall around it. And it's almost like you could see from one end of the city to the other end of the city. And because there was nothing built there. There was the temple. When Zerubbabel came back, they built the temple. So the temple building is there. But other than that, there was rubble and rubbish, but there wasn't really any buildings inside the city of Jerusalem. So it was based in an empty city. In verse 4 is a picture of Luke chapter 14 and verse 23, where it says, "Go into the highways and into the hedges and compel them to come in." God wants his house to be full. And God wanted people, the Jewish people that had returned under these two returns, to come into the city of Jerusalem and inhabit it again, to live in the city. They didn't have to. God wanted them also to be around the city, but he wanted his city to be filled. But there wasn't many people that wanted to come into the city and live in the city. Now, verses 5 to 73 are a registration of the people. And the list of the names that are given here is the same list that is given in Ezra chapter 2. If you go to Ezra chapter 2, the list of Ezra chapter 2 is the same here as in Nehemiah chapter 7. Now this list is approximately 90 years old now. And Nehemiah wants to compare the list of the names who came back with Zerubbabel with the people who are in and around Jerusalem. So Nehemiah, he has this list of names that came back with Zerubbabel about 90 years ago. And he's looking around, it's 90 years later, and he's looking around observing the people, and he's comparing the list of names on that list from Zerubbabel to now, to today. Now that the wall has been completed, the inside of the city will start to have to be rebuilt. But more important than that, it has been 90 years since the first list of names was written under Zerubbabel. Therefore, a cleaning up and a straightening up of the people themselves needs to be done. A recalibration of who is a Jew and who isn't is necessary. 90 years is a long time for people to fall away from God and from the law of Moses and intermarry with Gentile people. So Zerubbabel brings about 47,000 people, Jewish people, from Babylon back to Jerusalem. They build the temple, and basically that's about it. They spread out throughout the land of Judea, and they start making a life. Build a house, maybe have a vineyard or crops, have cows and sheep and goats and that kind of thing. They start living there. And now it's 90 years later. And here's Nehemiah. And now he wants to find out, of those 47,000 people that came back with Zerubbabel, how many of you are still pure Jews, and how many of you have intermarried and gotten intermarried and made yourself impure by connecting with the Gentiles around you? This is what he's looking at. This is what he's doing. Now, this list for teachings on some of the names that are written in Nehemiah's list in this chapter and their importance, you can listen to my teaching in Ezra chapter 2. If you want, you can go back to my teachings on Ezra chapter 2, and I go over the people of Anathoth, and also the Nethinims, and also the children of the priests who did not keep records of their genealogy. So if you want, again, the list in Nehemiah chapter 7 is the same as the list in Ezra chapter 2. And you can go back to chapter 2 of Ezra and listen to my teachings there. And it gives some important names there and history of the names there. We're going to start chapter 8 next lesson. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.